we'll leave that and let them try to kick on. Okay, good. So thank you all for coming. And as CC said, I'm going to tell you about measuring neural similarity, but I do have to confess this is going to be just a little bit of a bait and switch, and I'm with a little bit of hindsight realized that a slightly better title here would be New Directions in Measuring Neural Similarity. So I'm going to tell you about some recent and upcoming work by my lab and by some related labs in this space. So if anyone studies recommender systems, I can tell you if you were here for the previous talk title, you will also like this talk title. So as CC said, I have a background in both neuroscience and computer science, and I'm interested in the following type of question. So let's say that you are a brain and you are looking at an image, and some visual information is coming into your brain through your eyes and is being processed by these visual areas of the brain. A neuroscientist might look at this system and say that the visual areas of the brain are computing features based on retinal inputs, and neural activity in visual areas of the brain is representing the visual world out there. Or let's say you are a deep neural network. A machine learning researcher might look at this and say that this neural network learns some representations in the hidden layers and computes a probability distribution over classes for every input that we give it. So there's some clear overlap in terminology here. And at a really high level, my research sits in this Venn diagram intersection of looking for the principles that help us explain biological neural systems and the principles that let us design and analyze machine learning systems. So based on the language from the previous slides, you might say that there's some commonalities here in that both neuroscience and deep learning use terms like neural representation and neural computation and learning and other things like that. So I'm interested in, how do we think about these ideas and what is this intersection? But things like neural representation and neural computation are, let's say, notoriously slippery concepts to define. So the next part of this talk is going to be a sort of introduction to methods that we have currently for doing quantitative comparisons of neural representations across systems. So there's a number of methods out there that do this, and the general setup is we have multiple systems that we are interested in comparing. We're interested in knowing if these represent information in similar ways and if they compute in similar ways. So maybe you have a human brain, a monkey brain, and a deep neural network, and you'd like to know, is this neural network computing visual information in the same way that the brain is? Is the human brain computing it similar to how the monkey brain is doing it? And on the face of it, this is a really hard problem to come up with these maybe mappings between these different systems. So the general trick that people use in order to address this problem is they take all of these systems and they first reduce them to some common format where we can actually do comparisons across the systems. So let me talk briefly about what that common format typically looks like. So what I'm going to talk about is something known as representational similarity analysis, or RSA. This is something that has been around in the neuroscience literature for well over a decade and a half now. And the key idea of representational similarity analysis is we are going to take a number of inputs, for instance, a number of images, and we're going to pass that into two different systems. Maybe system X is a brain, and we get to record three-dimensional voxel activity out of an fMRI scan, or some record of the neural activity in response to those images. And maybe we pass the same images into a second system, like a deep neural network. Finding a direct map across these systems, as I suggested, is relatively hard. But comparing responses across stimuli within a given system is considered relatively easy. So this brings us to the idea, the core idea of representational similarity analysis. The idea is that if we think of each of the responses of one of these systems to an input as some point in some high-dimensional space, then we can construct this gram matrix. This gram matrix has a number of rows equal to the number of stimuli that I showed the system and a number of columns equal to the number of stimuli. And every element of this matrix is a measure of the similarity within the system of the response to these different inputs, often represented as an inner product here. This gives us the common format that we wanted, right? We take inputs, we pass them into both systems. Each system we do these within system comparisons. And then we have the ability now. Okay, the slides are getting just a little bit cut off on the right, but we now have the ability to do some comparison between the Graham matrices that we get from these different systems. That's RSA. There is a whole zoo of methods out there for doing this type of comparison, and RSA is just one of them. So the method that I was just describing might be this one RSA with a cosine similarity. There's also RSA with Spearman rank correlation. And I want to throw all of these at you just to give you the sense that there exists a large set of different methods, some of which are known to be perfectly equivalent to each other, some of which are known to be equivalent to each other under certain reasonable circumstances, and others are viewed just as variations on a theme. And so all of these methods end up being connected to each other, and all of these methods, at least the ones highlighted in pink here, involve Graham matrices. So this idea of having a Graham matrix in the comparison across different systems, doing the self-similarity test first, seems to be really fundamental. And I did not create a full map of all possible methods here. So I want you to take away that there's a bunch of related methods here and many more. For each of these methods, there's no end to the technical questions we could ask about how they behave. For instance, if you give me some function f, and this function's job is to quantify how similar or dissimilar two neural systems are, maybe x is a brain and y is a neural network, you could ask questions like, what is this measure going to be variant or invariant to? A really common one is if I take the neural activity in one system and I double it. So if I just make all of my neurons twice as active as they were before, most people would agree that that neural system has not changed its representation. And all of the methods that I've described so far are in fact invariant to that kind of change. So you can ask questions about whether or not the tools we're using are invariant to these intuitive qualities that we want our representational comparisons to have. You can also ask statistical questions, like if I can only measure so many trials because fMRI experiments are expensive, then how well am I going to be able to estimate these similarities and differences between these systems? How many trials is it going to take before I can get a good estimate of it? So you can study the bias and variance of these estimators. You can also study metric properties. This is getting closer to my work in this space, where you can ask questions like, does my metric return 0 when I measure the same system against itself? That's a sensible property for it to have. So it's going to, in this sense, we're measuring dissimilarities. So 0 is the most similar. Is it going to be symmetric? If I measure the distance between neural system X and Y, is that going to be the same as Y to X? And then you can also add this fun one, the triangle inequality. It turns out if you satisfy these, you can now construct a metric space over possible representations. This is something that I've done, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. But again, this is still kind of introductory, and what I want to impress on you is that there is this incredible diversity of methods, and yet they all seem to be sort of converging on certain central principles here. This is one survey paper from last year, providing a sort of unified perspective on 33 distinct methods for comparing neural representations. And here's a completely separate surveys paper that came out in the same month, basically, that suggested that we can study all of these methods in terms of this framework of data going into system A and system B, getting some measurements from them, turning those measurements into embedding, aligning the embeddings, and scoring them. And by choosing different ways of measuring, embedding, aligning, and scoring, we recapitulate all of the diversity of the methods that we have over here. In other words, we seem to be approaching some sort of unified framework here. In fact, not only do we seem to be approaching a unified framework in the tools that we have, you can also ask a question about whether the models that we're building in machine learning are like brains. There's a wonderful service available online known as BrainScore, where you can upload your favorite neural-like model. They will score it against known neural activity, and they will ask how well your system correlates with neural activity that was measured out of brains in a variety of species, a variety of tools. And it summarizes it like this. So this is a table of a screenshot from this BrainScore site that shows V1, V2, and V4. These are different stages of visual processing in the brain. And we can score how well each of these models predicts neural activity in these areas of the brain. And we can rank these models by how well they do at predicting brain activity. And what's really interesting is that the top models in this competition are machine learning models. These are models that were trained to do visual categorization tasks or visual segmentation tasks, or maybe visual self-supervised learning, contrastive learning style tasks. And it goes one step further. You can then look at among all the models that were trained to do something like visual classification, those models that did better at classification are also those models that do better at predicting brain activity. So this also seems to be suggesting that we are getting towards converging principles for studying neural representations, right? Both in terms of converging tools. So we are approaching a unified suite of tools for measuring representational similarity or representational dissimilarity. And it seems that even our models and brains are converging into common principles, and that the better we make our machine learning models, we are getting better models for predicting neural data for free. What I didn't mention before is that if you look in this leaderboard at the models created by neuroscientists trying to predict this, the best one is at like rank 35 or so on the list. So the top 34 models were all machine learning models that were not designed to predict brain activity. However, I want to take a step back and I want to compare what it looks like to form a map of the world in 43 AD to what it looks like to form a map of the world now. So when I say we have converging principles for measuring these systems and for constructing neural representations that look brain-like, we are charting the known world of possible methods and the known world of representational similarity tools. But do we know right now if we are a Roman geographer in 43 AD whose world map does not extend into Africa very far? Or are we charting all possible methods? Are we getting a universal picture of what these tools look like? So this brings me to the next part of my talk, where I want to take this step back and ask a little bit more of a deeper question about what these tools are actually quantifying and what we want them to be quantifying and what they might be missing. In other words, we have these quantitative tools that let us measure how similar or dissimilar neural representations are to each other. But I haven't defined what a representation is. And if you try to define that, you'll find that it's a very slippery philosophical concept. So, part two of my talk, a neuroscientist, a computer scientist, and a philosopher walk into a workshop. And this is not a joke, this is something that we did a couple of years ago. So there's a wonderful program hosted by the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience, or CCN, conference known as Generative Adversarial Collaboration, or GAC. And the idea of a GAC is that you put a bunch of people in a room together who do not necessarily agree on their definitions or on their methods, and you have them host a workshop together and then write a paper about what they've learned. So we did this a couple of years ago because I was wrestling with these questions of what do we mean by representation and computation in these systems, and what does this mean for how we study them? And I happened to be co-located in a lab with a philosopher who was studying this question from a philosophical perspective. That's Ben Baker here. And so we put together a team of people and hosted this workshop and tried to nail down from a computer science, cognitive science, philosophical, and cognitive science perspective, what do we mean by representation and how can we study it? And we came up with the following, and this paper is going to come out any day now. So we needed some common ground to start with, right? And the common ground we started with is that we're talking about neural systems, and we're talking about primarily perceptual systems right now. And so when we talk about neural representation, we mean there's some process where the world goes through sensory input, gives rise to some internal neural state, and that eventually gives rise to some behavior, like see a dog, pet a dog, right? Mediated by the neural activity. And we want to know, when we talk about this thing in the middle, this neural state being a representation, what is it a representation of? What are we talking about here? We came up with 3 levels of analysis here. The first level says, when we talk about representations here, what we mean is it's just some function of the data, some function of the input. So the picture you should have in mind is that the world gives rise to a neural state, we ignore behavior, here we go. So here's an example. If you read a machine learning paper, they might say something like, we investigated the representations in layer 12 of this neural network over the course of training. and found something. And this perspective, this implies some philosophical perspective on what a representation is. And the perspective is first that causality from the data to this representation is key. There's some image, it went through some function, it gave us some neural state. That function could have been a deep neural network, for instance. And we can quantify how good of a representation it is by measuring how much information it contains about the input. Third, this suggests that there's no one answer to the question of what's it a representation of. It can be a representation of the world, the input of layer 11. And another interesting implication of this perspective is that if you apply this to neuroscience, you might say that images come into the eye, and the eye is representing everything out there because neurons in my eye are responding to the visual world. In fact, you would conclude by this definition that it's doing so better than any part of the cortex, the higher level visual processing. In other words, level 1 is a great tool or a great perspective for mathematicians to take if they want to quantify what's going on in a neural network, but it's not really getting at this philosophical idea of what is a representation. This brings us to level 2. Level 2, I would say, is a little bit more common among neuroscientists. The idea of level 2 is that we add this hypothetical use downstream of our neural state. In other words, we might say something like IT cortex, infratemporal temporal cortex in the brain, represents object identity. It says that there's a dog there, and the retina doesn't, because if we look at that part of the brain, we can linearly decode object information from it, whereas we can't do that from earlier parts. So this idea of being able to decode this information is the concept of having some hypothetical downstream system looking at it and using it. The implication of level 2 is that we say something's a representation if we can imagine some hypothetical system using it to solve a task. And so our definition of what is a representation is going to come down to what is our notion of what's the task, what is useful for the system, and what does it mean for this information to be available or usable, for instance, the idea of something being linearly decodable. So exactly as I said, level 2 lets you capture the intuition that some part of the brain represents objects and maybe earlier parts of the brain do not. But this definition is still missing something according to some. This brings us to level 3. Level 3 is a definition of what is represented in a system that emphasizes what happens downstream, the use of that representation in behavior. Here's an example. You might see a neuroscience paper that says mediotemporal cortex represents motion information because electrically stimulating MT neurons affects behaviorally reported motion direction. The idea is if we go in and we causally intervene on this system, it affects behavior. Therefore, we conclude that it was representing motion. The implication of this is what happens downstream of some state is really what matters when we talk about something being a representation. And that this concept of potential usability, like decodability, is not enough. We need to actually care about what happens downstream. If you're interested in interesting cognitive phenomena like hallucinations, misrepresentations, and mental imagery, this, in a way, requires a notion of representation that's divorced from the input. You close your eyes and imagine that you're looking at an elephant, and I want to say that your brain is now representing an elephant. There's no elephant in front of you. I can't correlate that with the data. Right? This can only be studied through the perspective of how this influences other processing in your brain. In other words, level 3 ties this concept of what is represented in a system to agency, behavior, goals, and things that happen downstream. So I'm so glad I collaborated with philosophers on this project because I get to learn cool words like teleosemantics, the study of representations in terms of what they do and what goals they support. If you're like me, you find this a little bit hard to swallow the first time that you encounter it. So let me just hit you with one thought experiment that helped change my mind through this collaboration. And this thought experiment comes from Ruth Millikan in the 80s. And she says, imagine you have a fire alarm that when there's a fire, the fire alarm triggers, and when it triggers, people exit the building. Few people would debate that this fire alarm is a representation of there being a fire in the building. Then she invites us to imagine a faulty fire alarm, where this fire alarm has some crossed wires in it, the circuitry is broken, it goes off at random. It's uncorrelated with there actually being a fire. But every time it goes off, people exit the building. She suggests that This fire alarm is still a representation of there being a fire, not because it was correlated with the presence of a fire, but because it led people to behave as if there was a fire. Okay, so to summarize everything that we've done in this workshop and what we're putting together in this paper, what we did is we organized ways that people talk about neural representations in terms of information content at level 1, in terms of how that information is useful for some task or goal and how it's formatted in a usable form at level 2, and how it's actually used by downstream functions in level 3. Good. So now I want to take this back to the sort of starting question here, which is if we're looking at some representation in a deep network or some representation in a brain, we're interested in quantifying what's going on here. What does this tell us about how we quantify that? First, if you take a level 1 perspective, you would just do something like take the activity in some hidden layer of this network and measure how much information it contains about the inputs. And if you look in the computer science literature, you will find plenty of examples of this. For instance, the information bottleneck principle or the minimality and sufficiency principles. These are examples of computer science principles for quantifying how much information is in a particular hidden state here. If you take the level 2 perspective, you would do something like this. You would measure for any given one of these layers, you would measure how well can I decode information. And perhaps at the end of the network, I can decode dog identity or dog presence really well, but from some intermediate layer, if I do some linear decoding on that, I get I get some moderate information about it being a dog, but not very much. So level 2 would be something like using linear decoding probes, which is another technique that you'll see both in neuroscience and in machine learning. And finally, if you take a level 3 perspective, what you'll do is you'll focus on the part of the network that happens downstream from the thing that you're looking at, and then you will ask, what does that tell me about what's represented here? And I will just flag this as some of the newest and most recent tools being developed in this space and some of the things I'm interested in getting into here. But first, I will just sort of summarize what I've told you so far, which is that there's this zoo of methods, if you look at the literature for quantifying representational similarity and dissimilarity. I would claim that all of the existing methods on this slide are level 1 or level 2 methods. And to show that, all I have to do is show you this diagram. All of these methods run some inputs through the first model. They run some inputs, the same inputs through the second model. They completely disregard everything that happens downstream, and then they look for relations between the hidden states that you get out of these different models. So these are completely discarding any information of what would happen downstream of these. Now, I want to take a moment to address another counterintuition you might have. You might be sitting there thinking, none of this should matter because if information is available in my system, then my system's going to use that information. Why the distinction between what's available and what is used? So I'd like to tell you a brief story about how in one of my previous projects, we found that this was not the case. So this is some work of mine that was published 2 years ago in TMLR. It's clustering units in neural networks upstream versus downstream information. So in this project, we did not set out to make any grand claims about this philosophical idea about, upstream parts of the system or downstream parts of the system or what's represented. What we set out to do was to look for what you might call modular structure in neural networks. In other words, if you have some input that goes through a series of layers and you get some activity, we wanted some way of organizing these units in some hidden layer of a model into groups and to say that these are all computing one function, these are computing another function, etc. The idea being that modular systems are supposed to have nice properties. And okay, we need some way to, So essentially what we're doing is we're looking for ways of clustering these units together based on whether or not they're involved in similar functions or not. So we need some way of quantifying for any given pair of units in this model, whether or not they're functionally similar. And I will group these into methods that depend on upstream factors between the inputs and those units and downstream factors between those units and the output. First, you might just say, what happens if I pass a bunch of inputs to my model and I look at how these two units covary with each other? That's some notion of how similar they are. Another one is if I look for any given input at how a pair of units in my hidden layer are sensitive to the changes in the pixels, that is going to be an inner product of Jacobian matrices here. That's just measuring whether or not these two units are sensitive to the same parts of the stimulus or not. So another upstream one. Number three, we're going to look at whether or not the Hessian of the loss with respect to these two units. And number four, we're going to look at a downstream version of this Jacobian, which is when I wiggle these two units, how do they jointly impact the outputs of the model? And for good measure, we said this gives us four methods, but if you look at the literature for how people measure this, people also sometimes choose to normalize it and sometimes not. So we came up with this product, this 2x2x2 product of methods for quantifying whether or not two units in a network are similar. And you can arrange them in a cube like this, where on one axis it's whether or not the metrics are normalized, on one axis is whether or not we're looking at some covariance across inputs, or if we're looking at gradient-based measures. And finally, there's this upstream versus downstream axis, whether the measurement depends on factors between input and neuron, or whether it depends on the neuron to output. We went into this with a couple of sensible expectations, like it doesn't really matter which method we pick. They're all going to agree with each other. In fact, this was a sanity check that I ran, and this paper grew out of a failed sanity check. But our check was, here's a bunch of methods people use to define functional similarity. Which one you pick shouldn't matter. And hypothetically, if they do disagree with each other, it's not obvious which of the axes of this cube would be the most important one, right? Maybe normalization, maybe all the normalized methods agree with each other and all the unnormalized methods agree with each other, right? So it's not obvious a priori which axis of this space is going to matter the most. But here's the result. Hiding or glossing over a number of details here, but we trained a bunch of models and we looked at these measures and we formed clusters of units and we asked how much those clusters agree with each other. And what we found was a group of methods over here, the magenta and blue ones, all agree with cluster assignments, and these yellow and green ones over here all agree about the cluster assignments. But there's very little agreement in which unit belongs to which cluster across these different groups. In other words, there's a set of methods that depend on downstream factors and a set of methods that depend on upstream factors, and they disagree with each other in terms of which units belong with each other in the functional clustering sense. In the interest of time, I think I will skip how it changes with learning. But to provide a interim nearing the end summary here. So I started by telling you that we have this through a collaboration with a number of neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, and philosophers, we came up with this three-level way of talking about representations in neural systems. Number one, representations as things that carry information, two, being potentially usable, and three, involving some actual downstream impact. And what I learned from this modularity project, from this clustering project, is that the upstream factors that we might use to measure these things are going to give us very different results from the downstream factors that we use to measure these things. And finally, a lesson maybe for the students in the room is that, and this was really my big takeaway from this collaboration. How you think about a problem in philosophical terms can, in fact, have a pretty tangible impact on the approaches that you use. In other words, find a philosopher and collaborate with them and discuss your problems with them. Which finally brings me to some ongoing and future work in this space. So we have a brain looking at an image and we have a neural network looking at an image. If we want to understand what's going on in the brain, or if we want to replicate what's going on in the brain in our AI systems, then I would argue that we need new and better tools for measuring similarities and differences between these systems. Here's one new idea from some of my previous work. This idea is that we should stop thinking about this similarity question as a question about some hidden layer in a model. Instead of saying, I take some layer here and some layer here and quantify how similar or different they are, I should respect the fact that this is an entire sequence of representations in one model and an entire sequence in the other model, and they're related to each other. So I should be quantifying the similarities and dissimilarities between the representations in every layer within models and across models, and this is going to give me a much more complete picture of what's going on here. So if you want the reference, it's down here, but we came up with a visualization tool based on this idea. And the visualization tool says we can stack all the layers from a series of models. Here I'm showing you 7 different models and a number of layers from each model. And this matrix shows you the pairwise dissimilarity matrix. I take every layer from every model compared to every other layer in every other model, and I quantify how similar or dissimilar those are using some of these previous methods. This gives me a big metric distance matrix, and using some tools, some standard visualization tools, we can now take this and we can convert it to low dimensional embeddings. And we can ask, how are these representations changing as we go through from input to output in each of these networks? And we can look at the principal components of this space. So here, dimension 1 tells you the major axis of variation across all representations, across all layers in all of these models. Likewise, this is the second most important axis, the third most important axis, et cetera. And the models that I chose to plot here are somewhat interesting because the first bunch have a shared architecture, and the second bunch have a shared task. So the first ones I've marked up here, the blue models and the orange models, they all involve a ResNet architecture as part of their backbone. And the ones in purple down here, we're comparing ResNets to vision transformers. And what's interesting about these is that they're trained on the same task, but have very different architectures. We co-embed every layer from every model into this space, and we plot every layer now as a point in this space. Now, each model is a sequence of layers. It is a path through this space. And sure enough, all models evaluated on the same input start at the same point, and then we can trace how they transform representations through this arcing path. And then we get one set of tasks over here, another set of tasks over here, and we see some grouping of the different architectures with each other, where, for instance, the vision transformers go off over into some other part of the space and do their own thing for a little while. This is very preliminary work. The visualization tool was introduced last year. This is a brand new visualization that I just made last week, so don't ask me too many details about this particular one. Okay, so that's new idea number 1. New idea number 2 is not mine, but it's a really nice idea. And this idea is that we should really take seriously this downstream part of our networks when we're comparing them. So this is an idea known as neural stitching. The idea of neural stitching says we're going to take the activity out of some layer of some network. And if I want to compare this blue network here to this green network here, I should literally inject the activity from the blue network into the green network and then run the downstream part of the green network. And then if this mapping across systems is sufficiently simple, and I find that injecting the activity from the first model into the second model results in no change in performance, then I should conclude that the two systems had similar representations, right? And what I really like about this is that this is the only level 3 analysis tool that I'm aware of. This takes seriously the idea that when we quantify whether or not system A and system B have the same representations, we should look at how that information is processed downstream by one of these systems. I'm going to hit you with some other hot off the presses preliminary results here. And I'm going to call this plastic stitching for now, unless you have a better term for me. But the motivation for this is to say, okay, this idea of stitching activity from one system into another system, I love it. It's getting closer to this philosophical idea of level 3 representations. But it seems to be missing something. If you imagine this thought experiment of taking an image, passing it through a neural network, and then injecting that activity into someone's brain, maybe you're trying to restore sight to the blind. Well, brains are plastic. They will learn. And so it could be the case that we inject activity into the brain, and on day one, the person says, I don't know what I'm seeing, but after some number of days, they say, oh, that's a dog. In other words, maybe we should have some notion of the downstream system adapting in our notion of whether or not the representations in the first system are compatible with the second system. I can show you some preliminary results here. I've not been able to do this surgery on any humans yet, but I can show you what happens when I surgically implant representations from one model into another model. So what I'm showing you here is a number of layers from model A, a number of layers from model B. These are both ResNet architectures. And I can look at when I take the activity out of some layer in the first model and inject it into some layer in the second model and optimize just over that mapping, but not optimizing the second model. So this is classic stitching. I get some performance or some loss on the downstream task. Here, higher numbers are worse, that's higher loss. And so there's a big part of the space here where I can inject activity from one model into the other model and get good performance. The representations seem to be compatible. And then I can ask, now if I allow that downstream system to adapt to the representations that I gave it, how well does it do? So this is now showing you the change in loss compared to this first one once I account for some downstream learning. And what you see is this region where the stitched model had been doing poorly gets a lot better if we allow the downstream system to adapt to those new inputs. Makes sense? And so you might conclude from this that representations in two different systems that initially appear incompatible, but can become compatible if we allow the systems to adapt to each other. That's an interesting new idea that we're going to be writing up soon. But there's a wrinkle to it, which is that if we ask how long did it take to learn, that region, I'm now showing you a plot of how many training epochs it took to reach that performance. What we see is that in that region of the space where the networks became compatible over learning, that's also the region that took the most training time to reach that point. And what I like about this is that it suggests that when we map representations across systems, we can use the ability of the system to learn and adapt to that new representation as an index for how similar the representations were. So learnability can become part of our vocabulary when we're comparing representations. And I think I will skip this one because I've reached the point where I'm supposed to stop for questions. I had one more, but these are a series of new ideas, some of which have been published, some of which we're writing up now. And finally, I want to address the room and say, this is an exciting new space, right? This is the intersection of how we think about learning and representations in machine learning and statistics. It's how we think philosophically about what is represented. And it's how we think about maybe melding all of these ideas with what, our knowledge of how biological systems work in a neuroscientific or cognitive science way. And so what I've been telling you about today lives at this intersection, right? It's about quantifying neural representations and neural information processing in a way that respects all three of these disciplines. And so if you have some new idea for how to take something I've told you and run with it, then I would love to discuss that as well. So finally, I'm going to say thank you to my collaborators, to the funding that was involved here, and to Ty for inviting me to give this talk. And that'll take some questions.